Chapter 2 of the book Three Religious Rebels. This chapter is entitled, Never Sheath This Sword. Ermengarde usually got her way in the castle at Troyes. That is why just 3 weeks later, as the first snow of 1033 was falling, Theodoric summoned Robert to his study. For a few minutes, the two men stood silently together by the window to watch the hushed fall of the flakes. Finally, Theodoric turned and put his hand on his son's shoulder. "My boy," he said gently, "your mother has convinced me. So have you. At last I yield. You may go to St. Pierre's. You may go this year." Robert started to interrupt. "But son," went on the father, and there was a new ring to his tone, "if you do go, stay. If you become a monk, be a real one. Be steady. Be true. Be ever reliable. You say that you want to be gallant to God, then be so." His other hand went on Robert's opposite shoulder. He turned the boy fully toward him. "My son, look upon your entrance into the religious life as the drawing of your sword in the cause of God." There came a pause. Then more solemnly and more fiercely, "Robert of Troyes, son of my heart, I command you, never sheathe that sword. Do you hear? Never sheathe that sword." And Theodoric emphasized each word with a vigorous shake of his son's shoulders. After a moment of burning and intent gaze, he asked more quietly, "Do you understand, my boy?" "I do, sire," answered Robert, and wondered why he found speech so difficult. Theodoric then took his hands from the boy's shoulders and stepped to the window. With face turned away and eyes on falling flakes, he said, "The church needs fighters nowadays, son. Needs them badly. As you reminded me the other night, there was an election in Rome not so long ago. We now have a new pope. His name is Benedict the Ninth. It used to be Theophylactus." The giant lord turned. "Think of it," he exclaimed. "A 12-year-old boy in the chair of St. Peter. The Church of God needs saints to balance that monstrosity. Do you hear, son? Saints! You have been burning to enlist in what you call the higher chivalry. Well, burn! But don't be a fire of straw. Burn steadily as the stars in the sun. Burn on until you burn out. If you are going to give yourself to God, give all of yourself or give nothing. Be a saint." Then, taking the boy by the arm, he led him around to the fireplace. "Watch," he said, and removed the choke from the flue. The full sweep of the draft sent flames leaping up the chimney's jaws. "Do you see that, son? See the wild fury and flight of those flames?" Robert nodded. "Now watch." Theodoric closed the choke over halfway. Very shortly the flames dropped and the logs burned on with a steady, quiet intensity. "See what control does, son? Some call that banking the fire. What I want you to remember is that banked fires burn longer and give more heat. You have tremendous fires in your makeup, son. You grow violent at times, just as that fire did when the choke was out. That means lack of control. That means your flames are leaping up the flue, doing good to no one. That also means that your fire will soon burn out. Learn to bake your fires, son, and you will burn on. Then, very tenderly, he laid his hands on Robert's shoulders and said, "Son, do burn on for God. He needs some warmth to dispel the chill that must settle round his heart as he sees what men are doing to his church." That was the martial music and earnest plea to which Robert set off for his novitiate. Nor did that martial air cease to surround him after he had arrived at Saint Pierre de la Salle. For Abbot Bernard saw more than eager youth in the eyes of the 15-year-old boy who asked admittance. He saw soul fires of chivalry, and secretly resolved, with the help of God, to blow them brighter to flame. He led him to the novitiate with a smile and said, "Here is your tilting ground. Don't be unhorsed." The lad smiled back self-consciously and even blushed, but inwardly he was saying, "I won't be unhorsed without a struggle." When he turned from the abbot, he found 12 pairs of eyes fixed upon him. Instinctively, he knew these were his fellow novices. He felt awkward and most uneasy until one of the oldest in the group stepped forward and said, "My name is Maurice." Robert looked into his laughing eyes and knew that he had found a friend. The abbot left then, and Robert got his first taste of religious life. It was a taste of loneliness. Sleep did not come quickly to the lad that night, despite the excitement of the day. As he lay on his couch, watching the shadows that moved on the rafters, thrown there by the rise and fall of the fitful light that burned in the dormitory, Robert wondered if everyone, on entering the novitiate, felt the fright he had known that day. He was not afraid, he told himself, but he had been, and still was, timid. As he turned on his side, he suddenly remembered having heard his father say that every warrior knows a moment of tenseness just before plunging into battle. The memory cheered him. It made him feel bigger and helped him grow more calm. He looked across the room to where Maurice was sleeping and recalled the smile with which the elder novice had greeted him. Maybe it won't be so lonely, he thought, as he settled down in his pillow and finally closed his eyes. For the next few weeks, Robert did not have time to feel lonely. He was up long before the stars had gone to rest, and was kept busy until long after they had come out again to lend their silver to the sapphire of the night. From church to scriptorium to chapter room to church again, the lad was hurried in a series of duties that had him wondering how he had ever managed to while away a whole day when he was at home. Had there been no Maurice, Robert would have felt lost. The older novice came up behind him one morning and whispered, "Sit your saddle more loosely and you ride better." When Robert's face lit up with a grateful smile, Maurice said, "This is not a bulky horse nor a battle horse that we ever stride. Brother, he's just a good old plodder. Sway with him and you'll enjoy the ride." Robert laughed then. How well he knew what his companion meant. His father had used identical language when teaching him how to sit his mount long ago. As the days went by, Robert found himself growing fonder and fonder of this older novice with his keen, clever, cheerful ways. It was not long before a friendship was formed that admitted of debate as well as of banter. And the recurrence of these friendly arguments kept both novices serious while preventing them from becoming over-serious. Robert had just rid himself of all feeling of strangeness and had begun to study his surroundings more carefully, when he was summoned by the abbot. The novice felt his pulse quicken, but he had not been with the kindly Bernard 2 minutes before he was placed at ease. He leaned forward eagerly to listen to his abbot talk about the proper way to seek God. Of course, the lad was being introduced into an entirely new world and was straining to understand all the abbot had to say. Bernard noted it and smiled. He had always found novices eager, but he thought he discerned something deeper in this boy. To give the youngster something tangible and something familiar, he finally said, "Son, take the rule as your sword, your shield, your suit of mail." Robert brightened. He understood such terms. "It will be all that to you, my boy, if you will only live it. Believe me when I say it is not only a buckler for defense, but a broadsword for attack. Live your rule, son, and you will not only be safe, you'll be saintly. You will be a knight of God." Such concepts set Robert's soul singing, and had him marching around the monastery with his head held high. Maurice noted the change and allowed it to pass for a few days. Then when they were out in the courtyard one afternoon, he said, "Did you ever hear about the 12th degree of humility?" 12th? Laughed Robert. "I didn't know there were 10. "I thought so," said Maurice with a knowing nod. "How far have you read in the rule?" "Far enough," answered Robert. "I found the one word I want. It's in the prologue. St. Benedict says we are to be soldiers of Christ. That's all I want to know. Militaris is my rule. Militaris is my rule." Said Maurice with a twinkle. "That explains much. You've been going around here with your head held as high as a warhorse sniffing battle. St. Benedict wrote 72 chapters after that prologue, and his 12th degree of humility says that we are to have our heads inclined and our eyes on the ground." "What? Always?" There was incredulity in Robert's high tones. "Always," said Maurice with a smile. "Ugh," grunted Robert. The concept did not appeal to him. "I'm beginning to think I prefer St. Paul to St. Benedict," he said slowly. "He was a fighter. Only this morning I had to transcribe a passage in which he talked about the helmet, the breastplate, the shield, and the sword. I like that language. He was a warrior for God. I want to be the same. My father—" "Your father is not your abbot," interrupted Maurice with a laugh. "I know it, but the abbot told me the same as my father. He said, 'Be a knight.'" All right. Be a knight if you want, but remember that St. Benedict wants humble knights. If you don't believe me, ask Father Master." Robert took that advice seriously. He went to the Master of Novices. Father William liked the youngster, but thought he had too much confidence for his tender years. He could not reconcile the mature mind and the stately manners of the boy with his age. He thought Robert was posing, and had determined to rid him of his conceit before the year was out. Of course, he did not know all the lad had seen during those years of famine, nor had he as yet come to appreciate the expert touch that was Ermengerd's in the molding of a character. So Robert received a very clear, but a very curt answer to his question. He was told that Jesus Christ had been a knight, the most chivalrous of all knights, but that he had been meek and humble. The Master's closing words were, "Monks must model on him." Robert took that answer with him to church, to work, to chapter, and even to bed. He understood the words clearly enough, but he did not understand the sting those words had left in his heart. It was not what Father William had said that hurt. It was the way he had said it. Robert felt as if he had been accused of some shameful crime, and while he felt guiltless, he also felt disgraced. It was the youth's first encounter with a subtle humiliation, and he smarted under it. 2 days later, he was still pondering over his puzzle when Morris approached, smiling as usual. Robert stopped the pleasant remark that was on his friend's lips with the question, "Morris, can a man mean more than he says, or say less than he means, and yet want you to grasp his full message?" "You've been talking with Father Master," said Morris with a broad smile. "And you're talking about Father Master. He always means more than he says, and he wants you to understand not only what he says, but also what he means. What's the trouble?" "Just that," answered Robert seriously. "I know what he said, but I don't know what he meant." "Well, there's one way of finding out," said Morris pointedly, and gave his young friend a very knowing look. Robert understood that look, so before the afternoon was old, Father William was faced by a nervous but very serious young novice. Robert spoke most directly that day and was answered the same way. For Father William had to admire the manliness that had prompted such brave action. The result was that Robert heard much about pride and humility. In truth, he heard much more than he could grasp, but one point he could not fail to hold was that he was proud and had to learn humility. The lad was stunned by the charge, but he accepted it with a humility that left Father William wondering if he had made a mistake. He had, but it would be months before he would be convinced of it. And during those months, the young heart of the novice would be pierced often. 15, even an exceptionally mature 15, is deeply wounded when charged by one he regards as practically infallible with things of which his conscience does not reprove him. Robert was called haughty, independent, assertive, and proud, when actually he was only noble in bearing and honest in speech. But this misconception on the master's part brought forth the choicest possible fruit when the lad made a fierce determination to follow every injunction blindly. 6 months had not passed before Robert was summing up the religious life in a word. But it was not his favorite militaturas. It was the shorter, sharper, more incisive word, obey. Of course, the lad was too young to realize what was happening to his soul. But the truth was that the divine armorer gripped it between the strong tongs of his all-wise providence. He placed it in the fires of adversity to temper it, on the anvil of misunderstanding to mold it, and was now beating it with the heavy hammer of ungrounded accusations to fashion it so that it would never bend or break. But there was a cooling process too. God not only plunged this soul into the fires of his forge, he also cooled it in the welcome air of kindness, beneath the refreshing breeze of friendship. For the abbot had seen deeper than the master, and Morris had been attracted from the start. God tries souls with fire, but he never destroys them in the flames. Thus it was that Robert learned many things as the months of the novitiate mounted, and suffering was not his only nor his best teacher. Morris, with his irrepressible mirth, and the abbot with his fatherly encouragement and advice, did more for the lad than did the master with his earnest reproofs and some of the novices with their critical looks. Robert made all the mistakes commonly made by sincere and energetic novices. He was extreme in many things, but the abbot, with his kindly advice, did much more to curb the youth's impetuosity than did the curt commands of the master. "It took you almost 16 years to attain your present height and weight, my boy. Why not give supernature a chance? She is founded on nature, you know, and follows many of her laws. Don't be impatient about your seeming lack of growth," said the abbot one day. "That's nature's way." When Morris said with a laugh, "Some people think they are humble because they think only in diminutives," he greatly cheered a lad who had nothing but big thoughts, big desires, and big dreams. More, it helped him to true humility much faster than did the caustic, "You're too ambitious." And when Morris said, "You know, Robert, great talents stir large souls to emulation, but small souls to envy," the youngster understood better some glances a few of his fellow novices had cast at him. And so the days of his noviceship went by, some gray, some blue, some black, but the vast majority gold, with glad sunshine, all contributed to the boy's growth. But since the growing Robert was still Theodoric's son, Morris was not wrong when he called him exasperatingly stubborn. The two novices argued often, and not infrequently more heat was generated than light. There was nothing they debated more fiercely than their respective concepts of the rule. Under the abbot's careful counsel, Robert had developed a regard for the rule that caused Morris to call him a fanatic. The development was natural enough, for the abbot explained some portion of the text every morning in the chapter room. This daily insistence only sharpened the original concept he had given the lad on the occasion of their early meeting. The rule became everything to Robert, but this absorption developed a difficulty the abbot never suspected, and one that upset the boy. Between the letter of the rule and its daily observances, he found discrepancies. He grew disturbed. With the weeks, his disturbance mounted. The first snowfall of 1034 came in late November and found Robert looking out through the soft downpour of flakes to the gray tower of the new church that was being erected at St. Pierre. The snow and the tower soon started two different sets of memories ringing in his soul. One was of the words Theodoric had spoken just a year before, as the first snow was falling. The other was of the words Abbot Bernard had spoken just the week previous. But the words from his natural father and those from his spiritual father did not harmonize. This discord was something new. Under it, Robert grew restless, and though he told himself that his abbot, not his father, was his spiritual guide, nevertheless the advice his father had given appealed as the deeper, truer, better. Suddenly, Robert realized that this struggle stirred up by the snow and the tower was not exactly new. No, it was the very thing he had faced and fought several times in the past 3 months under various guises. Each time he thought he had finally settled it, but it always came back with greater fierceness. The falling snow seemed to bring his father nearer, while the thrust of the gray tower stood to him as a symbol for his strong abbot. For once the youngster, who had come to be regarded as the incarnation of energy, stood dejected and idle. Suddenly he heard his name called. He wheeled to find the master beckoning to him. "Come," said Father William, and Robert obeyed. As he walked behind the master, the young novice began to wonder what this summons could mean. Could it be that his latest argument with Brother Morris had not ended with themselves? Well, if so, Robert would speak out. Father William had changed toward him lately. He seemed much more kind and was noticeably more gentle. Robert determined to be most open. The master was looked upon as learned. Robert knew he was saintly. He should be able to solve this tantalizing difficulty for him. When the two were seated in the small bare room, the novice master said, "Well, my boy, it won't be long now until you take your vows. Do you think you are ready?" "Most unready," came the quick and uncompromising reply. The master's habitual calm was the only thing that checked his start of surprise. He had intended his question as a mere formality, something to start the conversation. For Robert was being called the model novice, and with reason. Many of the older monks had told the abbot that it did them good just to see the youngster around, and Father William now admitted that this was acknowledgement of worth and not paternalism. Robert's energy in everything from singing a psalm to sweeping a floor did lift one's heart. The boy was impressive. His physique and bearing made him stand out, but what inspired all, even the master himself, was the manner in which the lad had literally plunged into this life. No hesitancy or half measures for this boy. He gave his all. And now he was saying he was unprepared to take his vows? Gravely, the master of novices asked, "What's the trouble, child?" "Conflict of ideals, I think you'd call it," answered Robert hastily, and his cheeks began to glow. "Look, Father Master, the first week I was here, the abbot gave a talk that burned its way right into my bones. Perhaps you remember it. It was the one in which, after almost every sentence, he would ask, 'What would Benedict say?'" The master nodded. "Well, that has served me as a guide for most of my days here. At work, in choir, during Mass, in the dormitory, everywhere I would ask myself, 'What would Benedict say?' It helped me very much." The master was watching the novice closely. "It made me study the rule harder than I would have ordinarily." Robert stopped. His eyes had been on the master's during this recital. Now they fell to his own hands on his lap. He swallowed audibly and shifted in his chair very nervously. The master waited another moment, then said, "So far so good, Robert. In fact, I should say so far excellent. What comes next?" And he smiled kindly. Robert saw that smile. It was just what he needed. He answered it with a grin that was noticeably tinged with sheepishness. "Father," he blurted, "I'm not 17 yet. I haven't finished my novitiate. So I know it's absurd for me to say it, but I must tell you that often to my question, 'What would Benedict say?' I got the answer, 'This is not right.'" The master's smile remained as kind as before, but a more serious light stole into his eyes. Robert might say that he was only 16, but Father William knew him to be keener than some men who were 60. Further, the master had devoted years to the study of Benedictinism. He knew that there were good grounds for argument. He wondered how far young Robert had seen. He leaned back in his chair as he said, "I'm glad you've spoken, my son. It is not absurd at all. That you haven't finished your novitiate is the very reason you should speak out. Where is the conflict you mentioned?" "My father told me to give all or nothing." Robert's face was flushed, his eyes flashing. "He said, 'Draw your sword for God, and keep that sword unsheathed.' He said, 'Be a real monk, a saint.' To me, that means be like Benedict. At least that is what I thought it meant after the abbot's talk that day. But Father Master," and here he shifted to the outer edge of his chair, "we are not like St. Benedict. Only last week I was working around the new church. Father Abbot was telling me about the changes in architecture. He said that the new style, Romanesque, showed more vertical lines than horizontal, directing us to the heights rather than keeping us on the level. He pointed out the differences from the old style and showed their advantages. It was most interesting. But when he had finished, I looked at him and asked, "What would Benedict say?" I meant it as a joke. He didn't take it that way. He looked at me and asked, "Do you think we should remain forever in the cave at Subiaco? Nothing is too good for God." He sounded most serious, even a little perturbed. But Father Master, just what would Benedict say? Do you think he would find it too magnificent? Robert squeezed his folded hands, drew a deep breath, and answered, "Maybe not the church itself, but certainly our monastery and our manner of life would strike him as strange. Father, do you really think St. Benedict would feel at home here at St. Pierre de la Salle?" "Why not, son?" Father William was being wary. He thought of a dozen things that might make St. Benedict very uneasy, but he wasn't going to tell a novice about them. "We don't do much work in the fields, Father. Our serfs till our land. St. Benedict wouldn't like that, would he?" "We've got to be free for choir, son. We can't be in two places at once, you know. God hasn't given us the gift of bilocation as yet. He has done that to some of his saints, it is true, but I don't think all of us are saints yet, do you?" And Father William smiled broadly. "But manual labor seems so important a part of Benedictine life," urged Robert most earnestly. "Haven't you had enough manual labor? I've seen much of your copying, some of it good, some of it not so good." "Oh, Father, do you call copying manuscripts manual labor?" There was indignation on young Robert's face. "St. Benedict didn't mean that, did he? I thought he meant real hard work in the fields, toil such as the serfs perform." "I think he did too, my son, for that was about all the work St. Benedict had to do. You must remember that the saint led an extremely simple life. The monks under him were simple men. They were not priests, not even clerics. They weren't destined for the priesthood, you know. St. Benedict himself never became a priest. They had Mass on Sunday and on some of the bigger feasts. That was all. Their life, for the most part, was spent between the oratory and the fields. It was a very simple life for very simple men. But you see, our community is not of the same simplicity. You are from the nobility. So are most of the others. You are destined for the priesthood. So are most of the others. It is fast becoming the custom all over the continent. That makes a difference, son. Anointed hands are anointed hands." Robert blinked rapidly and nodded his head. He was thinking hard. The priesthood didn't make a big difference, he saw. "You have the privilege of serving a private Mass every day and of taking part in the community Mass. On Sundays you are blessed with 3 Masses. That's not like St. Benedict's Day, but you wouldn't say it was wrong, would you?" "Oh no," answered Robert quickly. "I love the Mass. But how about manual labor, Father? St. Benedict writes about priests in his rule. He says they can be received into the community. But the only distinction he grants them is that of a higher place in choir than would naturally be theirs. He doesn't free them from manual labor." The boy paused. He was embarrassed by his own intensity. He remembered what his father had said about banked fires. Yet he could not refrain from blurting, "I'm troubled, Father Master. I want to be the best monk possible. Now to me that means St. Benedict. But I see so many departures from his rule that I don't see how I can be like him and like the rest of the community. Do you see my difficulty?" Father William placed his forearms on his desk, leaned forward and said, "Indeed, I see your difficulty, my boy. But now let me ask you one question. I think it will solve your difficulty. If St. Peter came back to Rome today, this 20th of November, 1034, do you think he would be at home in the eternal city? Robert frowned. Do you think, resumed the master, that he would recognize the Catholic Church as the same church he had governed back in 34? I don't know, answered Robert slowly. The master chuckled. I think the good St. Peter would feel quite lost amidst the pageantry and pomp, say, of the coronation ceremony of an emperor, or even at the solemn pontifical mass in his own church. I think he would feel most uneasy surrounded by cardinals, archbishops, and bishops, by dukes, counts, emperors, and kings. I think he would be glad to go back to heaven. But the point is, Robert, that it is the same Catholic Church. The externals have changed tremendously, but it is the same Lord, the same faith, the same baptism. Do you grasp my point? Yes, said the novice eagerly. You mean that we are essentially the same as the monks of St. Benedict's day? Exactly. We are Cenobites. We live in community under an abbot and according to rule. The external differences you note do not touch the heart. Benedict would find his spirit here just as it was at Monte Cassino. I think you can keep your sword unsheathed, son, and stop worrying about manual labor. What do you think? A look of relief on Robert's face was answer enough for everyone. What do I think? He said. I think I owe you a gigantic thank you. I also think I had better learn how to think. Then after a light laugh, he went on. St. Peter would be very angry to find a 13-year-old boy on his throne, I'm sure. He would also be angry with many of the bishops and archbishops of the day, I'm equally sure. But he would find the same Catholic Church, as you say. These things do not touch the heart. I see my error. I think if you remember that a development is not a departure, you will find peace. Look, son, do you see that tree out there? Robert glanced through the large window and saw a spectre like arms of the giant oak. That has changed even since you came here, went on the master. It is bigger this year than it was last. It is much different from what it was when I first came here some 30 years ago. But it is still the same oak that came from the same acorn. Development is not departure. We have developed since Benedict was at Subiaco. He stood up now and looked out at the storm. Growth, he said with his face turned to the falling flakes, is a sign of life. Brother Robert, but growth means change. So if you want St. Benedict's rule to live, you've got to expect change. Robert was silent. At last he said, Brother Morris said much the same thing the other day. He asked me if my mother would recognize me with my big head, my big mouth, my big hands, and my big feet as the same baby she had nursed at her breast. We were arguing on this very point. So I heard, said the master with a smile. In fact, it was about that I wanted to question you. How do you feel about the matter now? Oh, Brother Morris is older than I, and he has more intelligence. He was right. No hard feelings. We had a fine debate, but he certainly has a sharp tongue. I know it, said Father William. He doesn't realize just how sharp. He has a very keen mind which seems to give an edge to his words. You don't feel antagonistic? Not at all, laughed Robert. We can have discussion without discord, Father. I like to argue. So does Brother Morris. Who spoke of hard feelings? I wonder who, said Father William with a chuckle, and then went on. You are right, my son. Discussion is the mother of discovery, but sharp tongues often wound warm hearts. And now let me caution you, son. You are full of fire. You blazed away at Brother Morris the other day, they tell me. And listening to you today, I can see that blazed away is an apt term. The master smiled. Robert blushed. Try the Christ way, son. Be mild. Hereafter, whenever I give you and Brother Morris permission to speak with each other, remember it is to speak, not to fight. You may go to Vespers now. Pray that we may always keep the spirit of St. Benedict. Robert took himself off. His doubts for the moment dissolved, but the master remained behind, staring at the snow, which still fell. Finally he muttered aloud, Was that parallel of mine spacious? Has the boy struck the real heart of the difficulty? Are we monks of St. Pierre, Benedictines after the mind of St. Benedict? I wonder. This was not a new subject for questioning to Father William. He had spent years among manuscripts tracing the Benedictines from Subiaco to Monte Cassino, through Augustine in England, over into the monasteries of the Frankish kingdoms, traveling with Boniface among the Germans, watching the rule take grip in Spain, Scandinavia, and the Slavic countries, seeing it supplant all other rules so completely that Charles the Great could ask if there had ever been any other monastic legislation. Father William had seen developments and departures. He knew much about Benedict of Aniane and his reform in the early 9th century. He knew even more about Cluny and its reform of the early 10th century. In fact, he himself was now living the Cluniac observances. But he had often wondered if everything that had been called development was really such. He was now wondering if young Robert had not plumbed the very depths of the difficulty with his question about manual labor. The bell for Vespers ended his musings, but it gave him no definite answer. Could Robert have been right?